benefit cost analysis is sort of the common paradigm that's used for policy evaluation and is very much supported by economists, and it emphasizes the importance of trade-offs or pros and cons of different decisions. It's applied to instituting regulations, building public projects. For us, we're going to focus on the use of basically benefit cost analysis to incorporate scientific reasoning and centralized expertise into the determination of the right levels of externality taxes or cap levels, damages, things like this. So these analyses tend to involve many different dimensions. They try to determine direct harms on economic resources, gauging the amount of destruction and the market value of that destruction, using prices, limits on the utilization of existing resources and the market price that you'd have to pay for that. You have to assess the market value of different uses. One very common thing is destruction of human life and health, and we'll talk about how market prices are put on things like those. It also includes intangible harms or subjectively valued resources that are either inherent, coming from ethical theories that people have, or derived from individual people's valuations on those things. Now, a crucial element in all of this is technical. So like what physical harms and benefits actually occur from a particular event. And that typically requires a detailed knowledge of, among other things, physics, because you have to figure out things like what are the chances of a nuclear reactor spilling over if something occurs. Chemistry, you have to know how much sulfur dioxide is needed to cause acid rain. Epidemiology, you know, if I get vaccinated, how much benefit does that bring to other people in terms of reduction in the chance of them getting a disease? But despite the fact that you need all these physical things, they're useless without having an economic backend. So how much should we value the land that gets destroyed by the Fukushima Daiichi disaster? We need to know that in order to figure out what the externality is, not just to know what's the chances of it occurring. We need to know how valuable are the crops that are destroyed by acid rain, and how valuable are the lives that are ruined by the disease that comes from the vaccination not occurring. So almost every one of these studies combines serious science with serious economics. Now, perhaps the most famous economic input to this type of analysis is valuation of human life, which is quite controversial because a lot of people say, well, human life is completely, invaluable. There's no way to put a value on human life. But if this were true, nobody would drive a car, right? People often drive a car, which is less safe than riding the bus because it saves them a few hours, which is basically equivalent to them making a little bit of extra money at work, right? So clearly, people don't put an infinite value on their life, and so it doesn't make sense for society to put an infinite value on their life. Just as Becker said, we're always making trade-offs about our health, so there clearly has to be a way to put value on people's lives. And in fact, this gives us a natural way to value to determine what the value of a human life is. And it has the potentially disturbing but natural implication that the wealthy's life are more valuable because they're going to be willing to pay more in order to reduce the chance of their dying. And the basic reason is that the marginal utility of wealth in any given unit of time is declining in the amount of wealth you have, whereas the value of additional life is pretty much constant. And therefore, people who are wealthier are going to be willing to pay more to have more life, which will be at a higher level of utility rather than spending all their extra money on having more utility, which is hard to do in the periods when they are alive. Okay. So it might seem unjust that the value of a rich person's life is greater than that of a poor person's life, but if you think about it, that's just one more thing that money buys. And we might want to redistribute, sure, but the idea that we shouldn't allow people to decide whether they want to spend their money on more life or more money on more food seems a little bit strange. right? So there are basically, therefore, three things that we need to measure in measuring the value of a human life. The value of some particular human life per unit of probability, the value of other types of injuries that don't completely deprive you of life, and the elasticity of these things with regards to income. And there's been a lot of measurements of those, and they tend to be about, you get a coefficient of about 0.6 to 0.8 elasticity with regards to income. Okay. Now, what is the usual approach in measuring the value of human life? Is Omar Pesca here? No. Okay. Does anyone else know what the standard approach to valuing human life is?
Like the net present value of income people have expected life.
That was before the economics literature got its hands on this question. But no, that's not the standard approach. Does anyone else know what the standard approach is? Did anyone read the Viscusi article? Okay. Well, the standard approach is that you assume, first of all, that the value that people place on being alive is purely based on the value of being alive, not based on how painful the death associated with it is. So that's a basic assumption that you have to make. This could be problematic if the process of injury is painful or degrading, and there are ways that people prefer to die one way or the other. But then you look at cases where people make a trade-off. So for example, you look at someone who you figure out how much more you get paid to be a miner than to do something else that requires pretty much the same education, because we know that it's very unsafe to be a miner. And you try to control for as many aspects of the workplace other than the risks created. And then you interpret, or you look at how much more people pay for a safe car than a less safe car. Then you look at the price differential between those two things, either wage differential or price differential, as a measure of people's willingness to pay. Because the thing is that the marginal person between those two things is just indifferent between the two choices. Then you assume that everyone values it the same as the marginal person. Because of course there's going to be inframarginal people to being coal miners, inframarginal people to more safe things, but you assume that all those people have the same valuation on their life. Now that's obviously problematic because each one of these assumptions are bad, but unfortunately, it is really all we have to go on. So it gives us a rough sense, maybe not exactly the right number, but at least it can rule out way too low numbers or way too high numbers. So it gives us some sense of the order of magnitude. Yeah?
But then the value of life is the value of the risk of losing it or getting killed.
Well, but you can calculate the risk of that, and you can divide it through. So that's how they do it. So they say, what's the wage differential? And then you divide it by the chance that it actually causes the illness or causes the injury or death. So that's how you do it. Now you can also use surveys to do this sort of thing, like how much would you be willing to pay to preserve your life? But for reasons we'll discuss in a moment, that's an even more problematic approach. Okay, so what are the numbers that they've come up with? There's a bunch of studies that have been done using this. Probably the two best are by Kip Viscusi, and they find value of human life on the order of $4 to $6 million for someone who's like at the median US income. So I think that's not exactly right, but somewhere between $1 to $10 million for a typical person in the United States is about right. And then you can adjust that to other countries using an income elasticity of 0.6 to 0.8. So roughly, if the per capita GDP of Colombia is half that of the US, a life of someone in Colombia would be worth a little bit more than half that of someone in the US. That's sort of the idea. Okay. So perhaps the most ambitious benefit cost analysis of all time was the Stern Review of Climate Change, which was commissioned by the British government along with some international institutions and tried to evaluate the benefits and costs of climate change. And it did this in many stages. Camilo Ramirez is not here, right? Okay. Does anyone remember what some of the stages of the Stern Review were? Yeah, Nancy.
They first try to
Yeah?
They decide what if, suppose we don't do anything, what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah?
Who's going to be affected the most? If you decide to do something now, but you have to do what are the costs?
Yeah. Exactly. So they went through each of the sort of steps of getting there. So first, what they tried to do is they tried to identify what the largest sources of greenhouse gases are. And Roman, what are the largest sources of greenhouse gas? Yeah, that's a big source, but that's actually probably the biggest source. What are other big sources? Automobiles and fossil fuels being burned for energy, right? Yeah, absolutely. Deforestation is also another major cause of increases in carbon. Then they have to look at what the effects of these gases are on the climate. And Anna, do you remember what some of the effects of increases in these gases are on the global climate and how that works?
The melting of the ice caps. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, well, I mean, but why just directly, why does putting more of these gases in the atmosphere cause the Earth's climate to change?
The sun things can go up.
Exactly. So the sun comes down, but it can't come out through these gases, right? And they use large-scale climate models to determine exactly how big that effect is, right? So these models say how much, if you put these gases in, does it cause the Earth to warm up. Now, these models have a ton of uncertainty in them. So you really don't get a single outcome. You get a distribution of outcome and how the distribution is affected by these changes. Okay, then they tried to determine the economic effects of these changes. And Juan Castillo, do you remember what some of the economic effects of climate change were that are most important from the report?
Less productivity in agriculture, some
Yeah.
disasters.
Yes. Yeah, so those are two of the most important ones. And also just the direct harm of it being too hot and people not liking to live in too hot places. Of course, there's also benefits of that. Me in Chicago would very much like if it warmed up a little bit. Okay. Then you have to determine the extent to which adaptation can mitigate these things. And Pablo, what are some examples of how adaptation to climate change might mitigate some of these harms?
Institutions that are trying to reduce extent to
Well, forget about, just imagine that a certain amount of climate change is going to occur. How might people adapt to the change in climate in a way that could cause these harms to go down?
like the people would migrate, for example, and
Exactly.
agriculture would move to other parts and
Exactly. But the problem, I think, is that the institutions that we have to actually deal with this are pretty weak. So I don't know if anyone followed the Hurricane Katrina event in the United States, but almost nobody pays for flood insurance because they think the government will come and bail them out afterwards. And therefore, a lot of the people who would naturally want to migrate because prices are going up for insurance don't really have an incentive to do that. And in fact, there's a very nice study by Rick Hornbeck about what happened after the Dust Bowl in the United States. You guys know what the Dust Bowl is? Dust Bowl was this time when people farmed too much on their land in the Midwest, and then there was a disaster and all the soil came off, and you couldn't farm it anymore. And in principle, we should be able, that shouldn't affect people too much. They should be able to move away. But in practice, they don't necessarily have the full incentives to do that, and it can be very harmful to have an event like that. And finally, what other, Juan Rojas, do you remember any of the other impacts that putting carbon into the atmosphere can have other than through the climate? Well, one major one is salinification of the oceans, and it can change ecosystems because more plants will grow places, and that can cause problems or changes in the ecosystems. Okay, so corresponding to the distinction between, between cap and trade and taxation. Do you remember what the two, Danielle, do you remember what the two, Solis, do you remember what the two approaches to analysis that the Stern report took were?
It depends on who is affected climate change. So they can put back property rights to pollute, and they can make help and trade.
Yeah, so those were the policy approaches, but then they, in the way they set up the analysis, they did two different analyses, one corresponding to try to figure out what the right tax would be, and one corresponding to figure out what the right cap would be for cap and trade. Remember that?
To be the marginal price of the effect of pollution.
Yeah, so they tried to figure out what the marginal effect of a little bit more pollution was, and then what was the other thing that they did?
The social impact on the
Well, that's the same thing. So they tried to figure out what marginal harm from carbon was given business as usual. So the benefits of doing that was that it didn't require them to estimate the technological costs of reducing and mitigating carbon harms, right? So that was a benefit. And so it was simpler and less assumptions were needed. But the problem was that the effects of climate change could be highly nonlinear. After you got past a certain point, it could get much worse. So the marginal harm is not necessarily that informative. But the estimate they came up with was $85 per ton of carbon. The second approach was to try to figure out what the socially optimal level of carbon would be. And the advantage is that that dealt with the nonlinearity and therefore with some of the problems of prices versus quantities we were talking about, right? You probably want to put a cap on if you've got this very nonlinear effect, right? But the drawback was that it required understanding much more about what the technologies are, how costly it would be to reduce carbon, and that sort of thing, right? So there they determined that it was optimal to try to stabilize things at 450 to 550 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. Now, both of these illustrate how hard it is to do one of these analyses. I mean, if you actually read through the Stern report, it's incredibly complicated to try to analyze one of these things. One example of how difficult this type of analysis is comes from the fact that a lot of the worst things that climate change does are not just make things a little bit worse, but create a possibility that something crazy happens and the world like really goes to hell, right? And the possibility that we could use geoengineering. Do people know what geoengineering is? So geoengineering is like when you put some particles of various different things in the atmosphere that could actually reflect the sun's light and therefore cool down the atmosphere. Now, if you have that possibility, that could cause all sorts of other problems. It might cause acid rain. It might, who knows what it'll do. But at least it probably won't cause a catastrophically bad outcome. So if things start getting really terrible in the world, that we could put that stuff up and that will cut off the worst outcomes from occurring. So whether or not you think that that's possible has a big impact on what you think of the effects of climate change, because it determines how bad the possibility is of some really catastrophic outcome occurring. And that could be a very large part of the harms of climate change. Okay. Now, the Stern report focused on sort of quote unquote hard economic costs, like the costs of reduced agriculture, which you can measure at market prices, et cetera, et cetera. But what it left out to a large extent was, do people like it being warmer or cooler, rainier or less rainy? That might actually be a huge part of the effect. In fact, that might sound frivolous, but if you look at land prices in California versus Chicago, land prices near Stanford versus near the University of Chicago, it's like an order of magnitude different. Like, you know, my little apartment in Chicago costs, you know, $1,000, $1,500. A similar apartment near Stanford or in San Francisco would probably cost $6,000 or $7,000, right? And it's basically, I mean, there's differences in lifestyle and so forth, but it's mostly because of the weather. So if you converted Chicago into California, that would bring a huge amount of economic benefit, right? And vice versa, if you converted, Israel into Saudi Arabia by increasing the temperature, that could bring a huge amount of harm, right? Another question is, how much do people care about all the animals that will be killed by the change in the climate? I don't know. It could cause mass extinctions, but how much do we value that? It didn't think about the value on the cultures that will be forced to migrate, or the cities that will be flooded. What are those worth? I don't know. That's not taken into account very clearly. There also might be private information among lots of farmers all over the world about how easy it would be for them to adapt to these changes in climate. That's not taken into account. So all of these share the fact that while science and expertise are useful to tell you the physical outcomes that will occur, they don't really tell us everything we want to know about how much people value those outcomes, right? And that's true for a very broad class of cases. So when there are subjective existence values for things in nature, I don't know if anyone heard about on the outskirts of Bogota, there's this big debate now in the Constitutional Court about what's the value of preserving the forests that have been invaded by all these people that are now living there. And the city, people claim the city hasn't done a good enough job of protecting the environment. So what's the value of that? A lot of that's subjective, and some expert could assign a value to it, but many people would think that it makes more sense to figure out how much people actually value that stuff, not just have some expert determine that. Another example is personally valued property or consumption. So if your home is going to get flooded because of climate change that was given to you, that your family has lived in for 10 generations, the value of that is not just the market value of that house. It has to do with the sentimental value, what it's worth to you to be living there, right? And local information about technology and impacts can be very important. So when it's genuinely important to elicit that type of information, it's important that we get out of people not just opinions or guesses, but what it's really worth to them, right? So the goal is to get information from people about how much things are valuable to them, not just to say, as sort of a religious matter, that what people say it's worth to them is how much it's worth, right? That's silly, because we know that there's lots of things people don't know. We know that they don't know all the things with climate. We shouldn't just go to people and ask them, what is it worth to you that climate change doesn't occur? Because nobody knows all the effects that climate change has without really understanding the science. It's much better to go to people and ask about things that we genuinely think they know about better than any scientist would, right? For example, if we ask about the inherent values of culture, a natural question is, do the inherent values of culture actually come, say, a culture continuing to exist, like an indigenous tribe in Colombia that maybe is starting to die out? What's the value to them of continuing to exist? Do we think that that should be determined by an expert anthropologist? Or do we think that that should be determined by people in the general public? Well, it depends whether the anthropologist is biased or whether the anthropologist has more knowledge. And it's always going to be a trade-off between those types of things. So one natural approach is to just ask people what they value things at, right? And Anna, do you remember what that's called when we go around and survey people? What is it worth to you that this culture continues to exist? No. Does anyone else remember what it's called? Contingent valuation, right? You ask what people would be willing to pay in order for things to continue to exist. Okay, so you describe different situations to people. You ask individuals how much they'd pay to have one situation over the other, and you impute this as their true willingness to pay. This is most commonly used for environmental issues, but it's also used for thinking about creating transportation options, public goods. It's a quite common approach in many benefit cost analysis. Is Francisco Ortega here? No. Does anyone else remember some classic examples of contingent valuation? Yeah.
Estimating the value of preserving some endangered species.
Yeah, so that's a very classic example. Payment for preserving visibility at the Grand Canyon was one famous example in the US. Preserving seals or whales in the ocean, which is sort of like what you were saying. Avoiding logging in national forests. Value of birds killed by the Exxon Valdez or by the Deepwater Horizon. Value of preserving languages of an indigenous culture that are dying out. Value of creating a new building that will bring some externalities to people because it's beautiful or ugly in a new city. And these are often commissioned by regulatory agencies, courts, and so forth, and they play an important role in benefit cost analysis for externalities, regulations, actions, et cetera. And they're also used to assess damages from oil spills and so forth. So these are formal money-based surveys, but they can also be done more informally. So just when you do a survey for a public opinion poll of, are you in favor of or against something, in some sense, any way in which that ends up influencing government policy is effectively a contingent valuation. So even if you think contingent valuation sounds a little bit weird, things that are very similar to that are done all the time, right? People go around all the time surveying, are you in favor of abortion or against abortion, right? It's not exactly the same as contingent valuation, but it's binary, but it has many, many similarities. And in fact, all the things we're going to talk about with contingent valuation and its problems apply to those types of surveys and using them in public opinion. Now, such surveys are in very low repute among economists. And Daniel Solis, why is that the case? Well, that's a good answer. So why might they lie?
Probably they think it's not important.
Yeah, so I mean, that's one natural reason why they might lie. Does anyone else have other reasons why they think that? Yeah, Danielle. So how so? But what would their own interest be? Why would it be different than telling their true value?
For example, if you're trying to evaluate whether or not to give a tax, people would tell that the willingness to pay
Yeah.
is actually lower than the real one.
Why?
Because they will try to deceive the interviewer so that he tells the government that the people are not willing to pay the tax.
That's if he doesn't want the tax to occur. Yeah. So that's going to be a big problem that we'll talk about in a minute. It's not the one that economists have usually emphasized, even though it's a very important one. But I think the reasons that people have usually emphasized are more similar to what Daniel Solis was saying, that people don't take these things seriously. Imagine someone came around to you and said, how much are you willing to pay to preserve the whooping crane in China? Now, maybe you've never even heard of the whooping crane, but even if you have, the main goal that you probably have is to get this guy off the phone, because he's wasting your time. And if you can get rid of him quickly, then you can get your money that he's paying you and get out of there, right? So like, why would you take this thing seriously? It's some bizarre question that you're never used to being faced with in your life. The other thing is that people often answer the wrong question, right? If you say, how much are you willing to pay for the whooping crane being preserved in China? You might answer the question, how much should society be willing to pay as a whole for the whooping crane to be preserved? Because it's just an awkward question. Like you think, how much personally is my individual willingness to pay to preserve? I mean, it's a very strange thing, right? And in fact, we know that people have almost no idea, information, or experience with these types of things for the most part, right? It's some very bizarre, I mean, in your everyday life, you don't have to answer the question. You all the time have to answer the question, how much am I willing to pay for lunch? You almost never have to answer the question, how much am I willing to pay to have some forest preserved, right? And a lot of people's answers also are motivated by what makes them feel good. So they say, how much would you be willing to pay to preserve this indigenous culture? They say, oh, I'd be willing to pay $20. But if someone actually came around and said, contribute $20 or they're going to destroy this, would you actually do it? You know? And in fact, all these things are confirmed by the fact that if you change the framing of the question slightly, you get completely different answers from people. So we know that you can manipulate these things to sort of get whatever answer you want. So I think probably the most important thing is people have no incentives to get these answers right. Like, why? It doesn't matter for anything, right? And in fact, it's worse than that. Their incentives are completely wrong. So very much in the spirit of what Danielle was saying, Oscar, could you explain to me more about what Danielle was saying? Why are your incentives totally wrong in this situation? Yeah, why, even if you were trying to do the right thing, you know, from your own perspective, why would why would you never want to tell the truth on one of these things?
Maybe because they're going to tax me for telling the truth. I mean, they are trying to, they ask me, how are you willing to pay for this?
Yeah.
Because they want to know my value of that thing.
But imagine they're not going to tax you individually based on that. They're just going to make a social decision based on this. What are your incentives?
For telling the truth?
Yeah.
Because it's, I don't know, if they are asking me about something that I do care, that I care,
Yeah.
I will tell the truth. I mean,
Well, so let's try going through the analysis. Yeah. Go ahead, Maria.
Well, in my office, one time we did like this contingent
Yeah.
evaluation
Yeah.
for analyzing, well, for trying to evaluate or estimate the demand for the railroad.
Yeah.
And I remember we faced like a lot of problems because, for example, in that case of incentives,
Yeah.
sometimes people want to say they would use more the railroad than they would actually do,
Yeah.
and that imposes a cost for them because maybe the railroad, if they say that they would use it more than they will do, the
Yep.
tariff or the price for the use of it would be higher than that if they would have tell the truth.
Yeah.
So that is a cost for them.
Yeah.
We also had a problem that,
But that would give them an incentive to tell the truth, not to lie, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
they were, well, yeah. But sometimes people, or they say that, for example, we also were interested in knowing how much they were, like, we were thinking about a pay or take or pay.
Uh-huh.
And we asked also if, like, how much would they be, would they have, like, the percentage of that take or pay?
Yeah.
They also said more, like that was insurance for the railroad,
Uh-huh.
and well, that was 1%.
Yeah.
And people not always understand the questions. And
Yeah.
besides, there are a lot of cases that, like, different scenarios that you want to ask. But for example, if you don't have the technology or the people who know how to ask the questions,
Yeah.
so you cannot evaluate this, like, complete scenarios that you would like to know.
Yeah.
And well, people don't, as you told, like, people do not take this seriously, so they,
Yeah.
when you compare answers, like having similar scenarios, you know that maybe they were just filling blanks and
Yeah.
that was all, like not thinking or they were doing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so Maria described one of two possibilities. So basically, I think there are going to be two situations that are relevant here. So one is that nobody takes this seriously and thinks it's going to have any impact on anything. And Roman, what are people's incentives in that case? Why?
Because they don't are
Well, they don't really have an incentive to lie. They just don't have any incentive at all. I mean, they just don't care. If it's not going to impact anything, first of all, why are you even wasting their time with this if it doesn't affect any social decision? And so I would sort of be pissed off if someone asked me this and it didn't matter at all, right? And second, so I would probably just deliberately sabotage the thing because it doesn't matter. And even if it does matter, even if people did tell the truth, who cares because it doesn't affect anything, right? How about now, Roman, what if this thing actually does affect public policy? Then what are people's incentives?
The answer is correct, but as Maria says, maybe they are not experts in what they are asking.
Well, no, actually their incentive is not to tell the truth. Yeah. What? Well, in particular, they have very large incentives. If they want to preserve the culture, if they think on net it's worth it, they should say it's worth infinity to me, right? Because they don't have to pay anything for saying it's worth infinity, and it will certainly be preserved if you say infinity. On the other hand, if you don't want to preserve, you say zero. You don't say like, oh, I'm willing to pay 50 cents, but that's not as much as $1, which it would take to preserve it. No, you say it's worth 0 to me, because you always want to get your outcome, not like what the person wants to do. So you never have an incentive to report truthfully, right? So one of my favorite examples of this was an Economist article on Haiti that I think is on your syllabus. So the Economist went around and they asked people, is aid being delivered effectively to Haiti? They talked to a bunch of people. And everyone said to them, no, we're not getting anything. And then he went and looked, and there was all this supplies that were at these people's houses. And he said, why did you lie to me about this? They said, well, look, if people thought the aid was getting here, then they wouldn't give money to Haiti. So we told them all that there's nothing getting here so that they would all give more money, right? So if it actually does have any impact, your incentives are completely wrong, right? So the only way to, make sure that the aid kept flowing was to lie, right? So that means that if we really want to take these sorts of surveys seriously, we need to think about the incentives that people have. What I just showed is that in these surveys, either you have no incentive at all, or you have a big incentive to lie. So why would you ever expect these surveys to make any sense, right? Okay, so now suppose we know, yeah.
What about election? I don't know, when you're going to choose presidents,
Yeah.
and you have an incentive to say the truth.
Well, I think it's very questionable whether you have an incentive to tell the truth on those things. I mean, I think to some extent you do, because actually you want your candidate to look like he's ahead because that gives him more strength. And you only have a binary thing there, you're not giving a number. But if you said, what do you think that the chances are that your candidate wins, I'm sure people won't tell the truth about that. Because they're going to choose it in such a way that's going to be strategically the best to influence the chance that their guy ends up. You see what I mean? Okay, so what determines the socially optimal? Okay, so imagine we know the private benefit B of Q, and we want to determine the socially optimal amount of the activity so we can put the right cap on it, right? So there's some externalities of this thing. We want to figure out what the externality to each person is so that we can impose the right cap. Now imagine each individual knows the harm caused to them, HI of Q. And the total harm is then the sum over all the individuals of that individual harm. The optimal cap maximizes the difference between these two things, right? Now the question is, how can we get people to tell the truth about this? Juan Castillo, how do you think we can do that?
You have to make people to have the same marginal cost and marginal benefit from that, but for individual people.
So can you think of a mechanism that could do that? Something that we would make people pay depending on what they say that could make them tell the truth?
They actually have to pay what they're saying.
Yeah, it's something in that spirit. So the question is, what does it mean by pay what they're saying? So one approach is to push the question back another layer. What we say is that, imagine I report HI is equal to H. I report that my cost as a function of the quantity is something like that. Then, if I pay the externality that it causes on other people, that I reported HI equals H rather than 0, then I'm always going to have an incentive to report truthfully. But what are the externalities of my reporting H hat rather than 0? Well, if we're going to choose Q star to maximize the social value, then it's however much worse off everybody else would be with the optimum including my H equals H hat rather than it being 0. So what does that mean? It's the amount that the total value to everyone other than me changes from the optimum when the value is this to when the value is this. Right? And let me give a graphical representation of that. So imagine that the cost to everyone other than you is this curve here, the sum of the cost to everyone other than you, right? And imagine this is the cost to you. Then if we add those two together, we get the total cost to society. Here is the optimum we'll choose then. Here's the optimum we would choose without you participating. And the externality you cause is the Harburger triangle between those things. Right? Okay. So the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism says that people should pay exactly the externality that they cause. Right? And to just be more pedantic about that, what it is that everyone reports their cost. We set a cap equal that maximizes benefits minus the harms, where harms are what are reported to people by people. And every individual pays the difference between the total benefits minus costs to society other than that person when the externality is, when the level of the activity is chosen to be the optimum given what they report versus the optimum without them. Does that make sense? Okay, so, and then the person may receive or make payments which are independent of what they report, that are pre-specified, that depend only on what other people report or something that was determined beforehand. So the crucial things to note are that individuals don't need to report their whole harm function, HI. They could just report something like, what is the value of my property? And then it goes into a computer, and the computer determines what the harm function is given a whole bunch of scientific information. So this is a scheme for payments. It's not a necessity that someone actually reports the whole harm function. It's just some scheme for payments where you will, if you report truthfully under this system, always get the best outcome you can get. Second, the externalities are paid not to the people who are harmed by the externalities, but to some centralized government clearinghouse. Why is that? Otherwise, if you pay it to the other people, they'd have an incentive to lie to make it look like they were more harmed, because then they know they would get more payments being made. This is a little bit like what we said with punitive damages, right? You don't want to pay the punitive damages to the people who are being harmed. You want to pay them to the government, because otherwise people have an incentive to put themselves in harm's way so that they would get these payments being made. Okay. So the most common form of the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism in practice is the second price auction. And Gabrielle, could you tell me what the second price auction is and how it relates to, no. Does anyone else want to try to describe the second price auction and how it relates to this? Yeah, Pablo.
So people, it's like a regular auctions, but only the person who has the, like, those who
Yeah?
auction, so the person who says the second highest price gets the thing.
No. That's not right. Does anyone, Juan?
The person who reports the highest bid has to pay the second highest price.
Exactly. The person who bids the highest wins, but pays the price that the second highest person bid. And how does that, Juan, relate to the principle of the VCG auction?
Because you don't get any benefit from reporting a very high amount.
Well, no, but in particular, why, in what sense are you paying the externality that you're causing on other people?
Because, well, if you report a very high amount, I just got confused.
Well, the externality that you cause is that you took the object away from the next highest guy, right? The only thing that's changing in terms of the value that accrues to other people when you change the amount that you bid is that you cause the object to be taken away from the second guy and given to you. And how much harm does that cause? Well, it causes the harm which is equal to the value that he says that he has. So that's what you should have to pay. Does that make sense? You pay the externality you cause to the guy by taking the object away from him by bidding the highest, right? Okay. So the winner pays the second highest bid, and that's the externality created because the next guy doesn't get it. Now note, as Juan was starting to say, that you want to bid your valuation. Why is that? And this is the same reason why you're going to want to report truthfully under VCG, but it's just a special case of it. Now, conditional on winning or losing the auction, the amount that you report has no effect on what you pay, right? It's just determined by what the second highest guy bid. Now, you never want to bid lower than your valuation and end up losing the auction, right? Because if you do, if you bid lower and you lose as a result of bidding lower than your valuation, that meant that there was someone who had a valuation lower than you, but above what you bid, and you could have just beaten him, and you would have gotten the object and paid less than what it was worth to you. On the other hand, you never want to bid higher and end up winning, because in that case, that means that there was someone who had a value that was higher than yours, but below what you bid, and then you end up paying more for the object than it's worth to you, right? Now, this is sometimes also used in multi-unit or package auctions. What are those? A package auction is one where rather than just bidding for one thing, I'm bidding for some collection of goods. Then to calculate what the second price is, we have to use the whole VCG mechanism. We have to say, what would have been the optimum had I not participated in the auction? That's the payment I have to make. And that's more complicated than just the second price, because the allocation of goods would have totally changed if I hadn't bid in the auction. It's also used sometimes in the course selection things we were talking about. And there are many proposals to use it much more broadly, but these are very uncommon in practice. So one example of this is eminent domain. So eminent domain is an institution, I don't know what it's called in Colombia, where the government comes in and it takes a bunch of people's land because it needs to build a bridge or something like that. What you could do is you could have people say how much is their land worth to them. You could then compare that to the government, how much the government thinks it's worth, and then they would have to pay if they end up causing the thing not to get built, right? That's one possible application of VCG that some people have advocated. That is, if you end up vetoing the thing because the construction would have occurred without you, but won't occur with the valuation that you put in, because then it's over the total amount that it's worth to build the bridge, then you're forced to pay the difference between how much the project is worth and how much people valued it except for you. That's how it would work in that situation. Right? Okay. So there's a very famous paper by Paul Milgrom and some others called The Lovely But Lonely Vickery Auction. And what they say there is that the Vickery auction is very elegant for all the reasons we've been talking about, but that in practice it's not used because it has a lot of really important practical setback problems. Does anyone know what any of those practical problems are? No? Okay. So let's go through them. The first one is, what do you do with the leftover money? All this money is going into the government, right? Into some centralized person. But if it ends up going back to any of the people who participated in the auction, that screws everything up, because then they're going to exaggerate the externalities, right? So what do we do with this money? I don't know. We have to basically burn the money. And if we burn the money, then it's not so efficient after all, right? Okay. Second, and this is probably one of the biggest problems, is collusion. So think about the case of eminent domain I was talking to you about. Imagine that I really don't want the project to be built, right? Now, if without me, the project would be built, but with me, the project wouldn't be built, then I have to pay a bunch of money. So I'm not going to lie in that case. But imagine I can get one other person who doesn't want the project to be built. And we both say that it's worth $100 billion for us for the project not to be built. Neither of us has to pay anything, right? Because the project wouldn't be built without each of us individually. That's a pretty big problem, right? Any two individuals, if they collude with one another, or not even if they collude with one another, even if they just wink at each other, can, without any payment at all, get the outcome they want. And in fact, that's an equilibrium. Because, you know, given what the other person's doing, why not say that this huge amount of money, right? So, an even worse problem is that imagine that we don't even collude, but just I can pretend to be two people. Then I can always get my desired outcome at zero cost by just being really, really extreme. Okay. So what that means is VCG, while it sounds beautiful, is a complete disaster in practice. Okay. Now, is Eugenio here? Eugenio Merlano? No? Does anyone want to try to explain intuitively what's so wrong about VCG? Why it's going so badly wrong? Well, the basic problem is that, and it's true for all these problems we talked about are the same, which is that under VCG, others say what is the externality you cause. And that determines what you have to pay. So what that means is that they're only incentivized to get the right outcome. They're not incentivized to tell the externality for any reason other than changing the outcome. And therefore, we can't give them the money that's associated with your externality, because then they'd lie to try to change what the externality is. But if you get together with one of them, then you do care about what the externality for them is, because you don't want them to have to pay too much. So you lie to reduce the amount of payment they make, right? So because other people are saying what the externality you cause is, you have an incentive to get together with them to try to change that. Or if you pay that to them, then they have an incentive to distort it, to try to change it. So what we need is some objective information somewhere down the line to tie down what the externality actually is. Because without that, we have all of these problems created by someone else saying what it is that you should pay. And we need to make people prove that they actually exert externalities, that other people actually exert externalities on them. That is, it can't be enough for them to just say that. They need to actually be making some payment which sort of proves that that's the case. And that brings us back full circle to the objective information that we were talking about to begin with, right? So there's no real escape from that. We said we can't survey people, and we can't really use VCG, even though those are the only two ways to get subjective information from people. So we can't just use subjective information. It's just not possible. The mechanisms that rely on it are too unreliable, right? So we may be able to determine the expected externality that's caused to people. If we have enough objective information to determine the expected externality, then we don't have to ask people what the externalities are. We can just have people pay their expected externality, and then they'll want to, as a function of what they say, and then they'll want to tell the truth. So if we have enough objective information to do that, we can solve a lot of these problems. Unfortunately, the expected externality does not give people an incentive to tell the truth always. So it turns out that the only system that gives people an incentive to tell the truth, regardless of what other people say, is the VCG mechanism. Because it's the only one that makes social and individual incentives exactly the same. In the expected externality mechanism, my incentives depend on what people actually end up saying. That is, if I'm only forced to pay the expected externality of my action and not the actual externality given what people actually say, if other people decide to say something completely different than the truth, then I don't have an incentive to tell the truth. I only have an incentive to tell the truth if people do what they're supposed to do, which is what corresponds to the average externality that I'm supposed to be paying. So this is the great strength of VCG, that it gives you incentives regardless of what everybody else does, and it's also its killer weakness. And this is a basic trade-off that we face, that we have to give up on you having an incentive to tell the truth regardless of what other people say if we want to have any chance to get over the problems that VCG has. And that's a big point in mechanism design. Anytime we start insisting on having everyone wanting to tell the truth regardless of what other people say, we're going to bring in all these really bad properties. Okay. Okay. So, in fact, we can show that by an extension of the Green and Lafont theorem that any efficient system has to have the property that if anyone changes the outcome, they pay the expected externality associated with changing the outcome. And this is basically just Pagoo's principle, right? It says anytime you have an effect, you have to pay at least the expected externality that causes. So we're coming full circle back to the very beginning of today's lecture, right? The nice thing about having things based on the expected externality versus the actual externality is then we can give money back to people. All the money that we raise, we can give back to people because people don't affect the amount that other people pay. They only affect the amount that they pay themselves. There's no real collusion issues because I can't collude with someone and have them reduce the amount that I have to pay. So the interesting thing is that most things in practice use something much closer to the expected externality than the actual externality. One example of this is the first price sealed bid auction. Do you guys know what that is? That's just the standard auction that we use most time. You submit a bid. Whoever has the highest bid pays what they bid. Now, your basic incentive in that setting is to guess exactly what it will take to beat the next person. That is, you pay your expectation of the externality that you create, rather than the actual externality that you end up creating. So the first price sealed bid auction is just the expected externality mechanism. And it's used much more often because the second price auction has this property that if I get together with the second highest bidder, I can wink at him and say, oh, don't bid anything. And then you can end up earning very low revenues. Here, you have people pay their expected externality and those types of problems go away. Unfortunately, in this case of the auction, it was really easy to come up with a mechanism that did the expected externality. We just had people pay as they bid. But in many other cases, it's not so obvious how to figure out what the expected externalities people pay are. And this is, in fact, I think, the biggest problem in mechanism design, is how do we figure out mechanisms that get people to implement the expected externality, because we know that the VCG mechanism is bad, and we know that expected externality is better, but we don't actually know what the distributions of all the valuations are, so we can't figure out what the expected externalities are. So we need to figure out a way to get people to incorporate this. Okay, so to sum up, there's basically no perfect solution to the problem of incorporating information into calculations of externalities. The advantage of scientific and technical studies is they don't have the incentive problem as long as the expert who's in charge is public-spirited. But what if the expert is not so public-spirited? Or what if it, more importantly, what if it leaves out all the subjective information that's important to decisions? We then might want to go to do a contingent valuation survey, which gets the private information in principle, but in practice gives completely the wrong incentive, so is totally unreliable. That might lead us to want to do the VCG mechanism, which gives better incentives to individuals, but is a complete disaster in practice because of collective incentives and the revenue problem. That leads us to want to try to have expected externality mechanisms, which are much more practical and useful when we can implement them, but the problem is we don't know that many places where we can actually implement them. So in practice, we should try to be as flexible as possible in trying to put these things together, weighing off their costs and benefits in terms of the actual situation, and as much as possible, trying to come up with expected externality mechanisms we could actually use. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have another example of expected externalities rather than the first?
You're going to have to wait till a week from Monday for that. The answer is yes, and it's the piece of research that I'm the most proud of, that I came up with an expected externality mechanism for collective decision problems. But I'm going to make you wait until we talk about collective decision problems before we talk about that. Okay, thank you guys.